So we'll continue sort of increasing in sophistication and actually going up further in the brain now to discuss the midbrain and reticular formation. So remember before I talked about these areas in the brainstem, which included the cerebellum and the pons and the medulla. Now we're continuing up this way. So the midbrain sits above the pons. That's this area right here, and contains several structures involved in sensory reflexes, movement, and pain. Again, pretty primitive types of functions. But the reticular formation actually runs this long area here. So it's not just one sort of compact component, but instead sort of runs lengthwise here. The reticular formation actually extends from the brainstem's core, from the upper medulla into the midbrain. And again, for primitive functions, this participates in the control of things like mood, arousal, and even sleep. Now let's talk about some structures just below our cerebral cortex. We'll talk about the thalamus, the basal ganglia, and the amygdala here. So early anatomists sort of pulled these things together into a system that they called the limbic system. And they often refer to this area as the emotional brain, although it's losing a little bit of that popularity as people learn more and more about this limbic system. But as you can see, it has these three components here: the thalamus, the basal ganglia, and the amygdala. We'll start with the thalamus. This is often referred to as kind of a gateway to the cortex. Other people often refer to it as a kind of a switching station. Basically what happens is input from most of our sensory systems, like our vision and our hearing and so forth, travels first to the thalamus. And then the thalamus sort of acts like a switchboard, in that it takes that information in and then sort of sends it out to the appropriate places in our brain. It's also involved with memory and states of consciousness and so forth. And you can imagine why that would be if it's constantly receiving input from our various senses and making sense of it and figuring out where to send those impulses. It probably has something to do with consciousness as well. The basal ganglia, this area right in here, actually is a collection of several structures involved in voluntary movement. So one of the problems with the basal ganglia happens in Parkinson's disease. In Parkinson's disease, people have a real difficulty handling things like voluntary movement and so forth, and often the basal ganglia are at least somewhat to blame in this particular problem. It's also suspected in a couple other conditions, including obsessive compulsive disorder and ADHD. So voluntary movement seems to be a big component of what's going on here. The amygdala, on the other hand, seems to be critical to understanding fear. It has an important role in identifying, remembering, and even responding to fear and aggression, which would be critical, of course, for our survival as a species, and the amygdala seems to carry a lot of that load. Additional subcortical structures exist. There's the hypothalamus and the hippocampus. So you can see those here. Here's the hippocampus, and here is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus in particular is several structures involved in both motivation and homeostasis. That is, keeping ourselves kind of on an even keel when it comes to temperature and staying hydrated and things like that. So the hypothalamus is involved in regulating our body functions: temperature, thirst, hunger, our biological rhythms of waking and sleeping, and even sexual activities. It carries out its motivational and homeostatic tasks by basically directing the autonomic nervous system and our endocrine system and its hormones. And we'll learn a little bit about both the autonomic nervous system and our endocrine system here shortly. The next is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is critical for forming long-term memories. And in fact, damage to the hippocampus often leads to amnesia, in which one can't form new memories any longer, or it becomes really difficult to form those new memories. It's involved in the storage and retrieving of memories located elsewhere in our brains, I should say. There's a good TED Talk about the hippocampus right here, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that. So let's continue talking about this. The forward 2/3 of one of the structures is known as the anterior cingulate cortex. It participates with the hypothalamus in controlling our autonomic nervous system. It's also important in decision making, emotion, anticipation of reward, and empathy. So you can see the cingulate cortex here. Here's the posterior cingulate cortex, right back here, of course, posterior, and the anterior cingulate cortex here. The rear third, or the posterior cingulate cortex, this component here, participates in memory and visual processing. So let's see if we can get this straight again. Our anterior cingulate cortex is helpful for decision making, emotion, anticipation of reward, and empathy. And as you can see, as we're moving up further in here, we're getting to a little bit more sophisticated types of behaviors and systems in our brain. And the posterior cingulate cortex, again, involved in memory and visual processing. One of the things we'll learn, you'll notice this is visual processing here, which is sort of posterior towards the front. Later we'll learn about the occipital lobe, where a lot of our visual processing takes place in close proximity to this. It's also important to look at the nucleus accumbens. This is an important part of the brain's reward and pleasure circuitry. So you can begin to see that in these subcortical structures, right below the cortex, there's a lot of things that are related to motivation and emotion. And these areas are located right here.